Vladimir Bukovsky on Russian and Soviet culture in a conversation with George Urban. Encounter Magazine, November 1987. George Urban. A friend of mine with whom I once burnt the midnight oil puzzling over the meaning of life was in the habit of saying everyone must have a petit chateau in his imagination where he can find shelter from the hard knocks and banalities of the human condition. I recalled this phrase vividly when I first read your book, To Build a Castle. For the chateau you were constructing for yourself during your imprisonments in the Soviet Union was, or so it seems to me, precisely that kind of refuge, a haven of hope and sanity in a world of coercion and psychiatric abuse. Vladimir Bukovsky. The way I came to think of the image of a castle takes me back to my childhood. I was a young teenager, 13 or 14 or so, when Khrushchev's impact began to be felt in the Soviet Union. Of course, at the time I didn't understand half of what was going on around me, but what I did understand was that some momentous change was looming and that I did not like the world into which I'd been born. I was a voracious reader but couldn't bring myself to read Soviet literature. It wasn't that I was consciously hostile to it, I just had an instinctive dislike of this stuff because I found it mean and drab. So I ploughed through the Russian classics and the non-Russian classics in translation, and in my Russian books, Chekhov for example, I ran repeatedly into scenes that occurred in spacious country houses which gave the reader a feel of a rather genuine, thoughtful, reflective type of living, light years away from Soviet reality. I spent some of my childhood in one of the historic quarters of Moscow, the Arbat. My grandmother often took me for walks there, and it was in the Arbat that I first saw old, gracious mansions of the kind I was to encounter in the classics. In other words, by the time I came to read about the sort of life people lived in a traditional and cultivated milieu, I was already attuned to it, by the merging of a child's instinctive aspiration to a more inspiring order of things with the mysterious beauty of the mansions in the Arbat. Urban. You are clearly not one of the success stories of ideological conditioning by the Soviet system. Bukovsky. No, I wasn't, even though I came from a fairly poor family and was in reality nothing but a street urchin when these impressions began to register. As time went on, I developed great love for those buildings in the Arbat, and looking back on my thinking as an adolescent, I suppose it would be true to say that those mansions represented a form of mental escape for me, although I wasn't aware of it at the time. Urban. Your genes seem to have been stronger than the impact of your environment. Bukovsky. Much stronger. What's more, style seemed to me more important than substance. The architectural grace of the buildings in the Arbat introduced me to weave a whole world of values and ideas that began to sustain me spiritually. Urban. What you're saying is that Pol Pot and the Red Guards under Mao were, in their way, right. Your resistance to the system was greatly helped by the availability of the Russian classics and the survival of old buildings. Pol Pot took care to demolish all remnants of a bourgeois past, including books and buildings and indeed even the spectacles through which to peer at them. Bukovsky. From his point of view, Pol Pot was right. Fortunately, Stalinism was slightly less thorough, and the lip service it had to pay to the Russian past made it impossible for the Stalinists to do a demolition job on the whole of Russian culture and history. They did it on selected parts, and at times best suited to their purpose. Urban. So the idea of a castle came naturally from your inclinations as a child and an adolescent? Bukovsky. It developed from the skein of factors I've described. By the time I first went to prison, it was there. Urban. Perhaps it wasn't just a mental escape, but a subconscious protest against your environment, against proletarian culture and socialist realism. Bukovsky. Looking at it from today's perspective, I would say it was. Soviet reality is grey and ugly, and the artifacts of life are just tasteless and boring. I'm grateful to my own choosiness as a child that I never read Soviet literature. I escaped its corruptions. You managed, in fact, to develop on a small and rudimentary scale something like your own sense of values and culture, a remarkable feat for a young boy. Bukovsky. In a modest sense, yes. I wouldn't go as far as to call it an alternative culture, for my friends and I were too young and ignorant to think in such sophisticated terms. But as far as my own aesthetic ideas and values were concerned, yes, I think I did begin to develop alternative ways of feeling and being. Urban. In prison, your castle was in fact a lifesaver. In the frightening void of your solitary confinement, you hung on to it the way a drowning man hangs on to a lifebelt. Or, if you like, it was a source of hope, as faith and prayer are for a believer. Bukovsky. It was all those things, but the castle also performed the simple function of occupying my mind and keeping it concentrated. This was most important. I knew people who went berserk in solitary. Any systematic thinking helped, such as remembering the plot of a classic novel or solving mathematical problems. Urban. I once had a discussion with Don Salvador de Madariaga on a similar topic, taking Arnold Toynbee's challenge and response for our cue. We were wondering where one should draw the line between useful hardship and hardship that kills, for it was clear to us that a man of civilization that has too easy a time of it, or is just treading water, is unlikely to be creative. We observed that between the unchallenged type of human life and the experiences of Auschwitz, there were many gradations of hardship that put the right mixture of pressures on us to make us more creative or just more fully rounded and more sensitive human beings. I took the view that a good deal of historically or socially induced suffering was good for us. Salvador de Madariaga, on the other hand, felt that the ordinary hardships of human life — sickness, bereavement, frustration, the terrors of old age, the disloyalty of friends, and so on — were enough to equip us with the right amount of suffering, and here was no need to ask a Franco or a Stalin to provide additional punishment, or to have famine or war visited upon society. He was probably right. It seems to me that your own experiences fall into the category of profitable suffering, for imprisonment and the pressures of Soviet society in the 1960s and 1970s, though still appalling by Western standards, were no longer what they'd been under Stalin. Bukovsky. Freedom is an inner quality which cannot be bestowed or taken away by anyone but yourself. Using for a moment the crude terms of the market economy, I would say you can almost always have your freedom if you're willing to pay the price for it. In the Soviet system, the price of freedom is exceptionally high. In the Western liberal democracies, it is exceptionally low. In a Soviet prison, you may decide to help a friend who's been unjustly punished, and be punished yourself for helping him. Or else you may decide, I'll ignore it and escape punishment. The choice is yours. It's a question of how much you're prepared to pay for your inner freedom. I was gratified to read that Valladares in Cuba felt the same, although his imprisonment by a vindictive Castro was closer to the horrors of Stalin's camps and prisons than mine was. It's been frequently held against me that, but your time inside was a mild affair. You could talk back, you could demand to read the Soviet constitution, and the prison governor himself would bring it to you so that you could write your complaints. You could lecture your interrogators. You could do many things because the context had been changed and torture had been ruled out. Now, in 1938, they would have beaten you into pulp, and your friends abroad would never have heard about it. Well, it's perfectly true that under Stalin the price of inner freedom was exceedingly high, but even then you could attain it. Varlam Shalamov, who spent years under severe conditions in the frozen Far East in one of the worst of Stalin's camps, tells us that even there you could preserve your inner freedom. The price was high. Oh, it was high. But you could have it. In other words, so long as the system doesn't kill you, you're likely to emerge a better, a more sensitive man. Urban. But what, in your judgment, would be the right mix of hardships? Poets, playwrights, philosophers have given us a great many memorable words about the creative beauty of unrequited love, the fascinations of Inferno as distinct from the placid tedium of Paradiso and the like. But one wonders whether people undergoing the agonies of unrequited love, or roasting in the fires of Inferno, would approve of their ordeal if you told them, but you are the anvil on which the future Dantes and Goethes will hammer out their immortal work. Bukovsky. To forge character, promote independent thinking, or even to fulfill himself, man needs to run into obstacles and be constantly challenged. When I lived in the USA, I noticed that most people around me in California were miserable, although they lived in highly relaxed and comfortable conditions. Why? Because they lacked the challenges of hardship. They were in search, not of food or shelter, but of themselves. They had identity crises. The Californian asked, "Who am I?" and went off to the psychiatrist to find a reassuring answer. And it wasn't only Californians, but Americans in general who seem to suffer from the sort of self-questioning that comes from too much comfort, too much superficial living, and too little suffering. Challenges can have degrees of usefulness. There are challenges that stimulate some people but not others. Suffering, too, has its gradations. Some lead you to a better understanding of the human condition, while others send you into depression. There are anvils that temper you and anvils that kill you. Hardship may lead some people of strong character and great stamina to feats of creativity, religious insight, sacrifice, and the like, but these exceptional achievements are usually attained under conditions that would simply destroy the majority of ordinary people. So let's not rejoice too much over the achievement of those who are lucky enough to become heroes, because the peaks they represent for us are surrounded by mounds of the unsung dead. I will never subscribe to the argument that the Soviet system is good for you because its particular beastliness produces exceptional dissidents.